Hello, I'm Rabbi Ain. Welcome to Congregation Beth Sholom in San Francisco, and this is our lunch break study for Wednesday, March 3rd, 2021. And this week we're going to have a conversation about the status of who is a Jew in light of the recent decision by the Israeli Supreme Court. So what I want to do is I'm going to do this in a few parts. The first part of the conversation, so one of the pieces of feedback that I've received is that I can move too quickly, that I can speak in too much academic or rabbinic jargon. And so I'm going to work to minimize that going forward. So what I'm going to do to address this topic is we're going to start with some media reports. I am a rabbi, that is true, Judah, but I can make things more accessible. And I do love geeking out in the jargon, and some of you do too. But we're going to try to see if we can open it up a little bit more. So I want to let's just start with the article that appeared in the New York Times, if you didn't see it. It is from 2 days ago. So Israeli court says converts to non-Orthodox Judaism can claim citizenship. The people who convert in Israel to Reform or Conservative Judaism have a right to citizenship, the Supreme Court ruled, chipping at the power of Orthodox authorities to see them as non-Jewish. So let's give a little bit of the story here. The question of who is and isn't a Jew has always been a subject of debate within Israel. Since the state was founded, the government has largely deferred to Orthodox Jewish authorities who do not view converts to more liberal forms of Judaism as Jewish. But on Monday, the Israeli Supreme Court struck a symbolic blow for a more pluralistic vision of Jewish identity. It granted the right to automatic citizenship to foreigners who convert within the state, note within the state of Israel, to conservative, also known as Masorti or Reform Judaism. The decision was mainly symbolic because typically only 30 or 40 foreigners convert to Reform or Masorti Judaism in Israel every year. According to the Israel Religious Action Center, the rights group that led efforts to obtain the court ruling. So the ruling does chip away some of the monopoly Orthodox rabbis have held over questions of religious identity that are central to frictions within Israeli society. It also inflames a long-running debate about the relationship between Israel's civil and religious authorities, and particularly the role of the Supreme Court. Okay, so that's the New York Times report on the story, which allows people who convert either to a Reform conversion or a conservative conversion to become citizens of the state of Israel. So that's a little bit of the background here. Good news, bad news? What do we think? Good news? Positive news? Yeah?
Am I missing something? I mean, it says it's a blow to the pluralistic idea. I don't get that. And only 30 to 40 convert. I don't get that.
In Israel. So only 30 to 40 conversions, they're saying, happen of the Reform or Masorti variety in Israel per year. This would not qualify for conversions done outside of the state. Maybe I'll continue reading the story because it will clear that up.
How about a blow to plurality? I mean, I don't understand that line.
A blow to plurality? No, I think it was a blow for a more pluralistic vision, a symbolic blow in favor of a more pluralistic vision of Jewish identity, is what they're saying here. So why don't I, instead of going through the New York Times, why don't I just do this? Why don't I pull out some interpretations that come from other non-secular sources?
Can I just, ask something here real quick?
Sure.
So this doesn't really seem the Israeli decision. It's not really about who's a Jew. It's about who's a rabbi, right? Because what's the difference between somebody? The only difference between somebody converted Reform or somebody converted conservative, the reason that wasn't accepted before is because that Reform rabbi was not a real rabbi and that conservative rabbi was not a real rabbi, right? And therefore, they don't have the authority to convert anybody to anything.
Correct.
So that's a different question than who's a Jew.
Well, they're all folded into the same question. And I think, yeah.
I don't think you'd set, unless people understand the dynamics of all of that in Israel, I mean, this discussion really can't take place. If you like, I can lay that out, or you should lay it out, but someone should describe what set this up.
Well, there is the Rabbinut of Israel. I didn't want to read through the whole story, but maybe I will. Hold on one second.
They don't say it in there because, well, I'll say it. I mean,
so you explain it. Go right ahead.
Israel was faced with a problem after the Shoah, where the Nazis decided as long as one of your grandparents was Jewish, you were Jewish. And that was good enough for them. And when Israel was established, they decided for the law of return purposes that they would accept that definition. However, they created a compromise where the Rabbinut got to decide all matters of religion, which included weddings and other rights. And so you're forced with a thing. And now the big situation is with the Russians, who most of them are not halachically Jewish, have never converted, but they had a Jewish stamp on their passport in Russia, so Israel accepted them. Now, if someone now the complexity then becomes, if you have a conversion, if you're an American Jew and you have a conversion in America by Rabbi Ain or by a Reform rabbi, you're accepted in Israel by the law of return as long as I think you've lived in your conversion community for 2 years. However, you still can't get married in Israel because it was not an Orthodox conversion, therefore you're not recognized. Many of you are, for example, aware of the problem Elaine Grossbard's daughter had when she went to Israel. Elaine was raised in an Orthodox household, married with an Orthodox household with an Orthodox ketubah. She had her ketubah, she had her mother's ketubah. All the proof that she was Orthodox, but she did not have a letter from an Orthodox rabbi from her daughter saying that she was Jewish, so they would not allow her daughter to marry in Israel. Elaine finally did, because she worked at the Jewish library, get a letter from Rabbi Zarki, who did not know her daughter, but said, Elaine, I know you and I'll write it, and they accepted his letter. But an American Jew today, whether you are Jewish under any circumstances, cannot get married in Israel because they don't accept, they said there's no chief rabbi who certifies that you're Jewish. So this is a narrow sliver mostly for the Russians who have gone to Israel and are now converting to Judaism in a thing, but the Orthodox, the Rabbinut still controls all matters of religious decisions, including weddings and the like.
Okay, thank you. Yes, Ellen.
A point of clarification. So with this new ruling, if you were a convert in the United States and you went to Israel and a Reform rabbi or a conservative rabbi in Israel renewed your conversion, then you'd be okay according to this. Is that right?
You don't need that. I mean, you're already accepted as a Jew. You just can't marry.
So let's. I think Gary, you moved us a little too far into the weeds. So I want to pull back a little bit. And what I want to do is take the reaction to this ruling, because what it means, as Gary points out, is tied up into the law of return. It's tied up in the role that the chief rabbinut has to determine status, to determine who can and cannot get married in the state of Israel. And so I'm interested to see what the reaction to this is. And I want to begin with the yeshiva world here. So let's just take a look. I am at reactions across 3 denominational lines. So this is yesterday's yeshiva world. Israel's Supreme Court ruled on Monday that people converted by the reform and conservative movements in Israel will be recognized as Jewish and can become Israeli citizens through the law of return. The ruling comes after a 15-year legal battle following petitions to the Supreme Court in 2005 demanding that Israeli citizenship be granted to 12 residents who converted through the reform and conservative movements in Israel. Supreme Court ruled in '88 that non-Orthodox conversions performed outside of Israel are recognized, but did not recognize non-Orthodox conversions performed in Israel. Israel's chief rabbis and religious politicians slammed the court's decisions and promised the ruling will be overturned. The Likud party also condemned the ruling. The decision of the Supreme Court is very unfortunate and seriously harms the shlimos of Am Yisrael, the completeness of Am Yisrael, said Chief Rabbi of Israel, Harav Yitzchak Yosef. What the reform and conservative call giur is nothing but a falsification of Judaism and means bringing thousands of goyim into Am Yisrael. Chief Rabbi Harav David Lau said, whoever converted through reform and similar movements are not Jews, and no decision of the Supreme Court will change that fact. It is unfortunate that through its decision, the Supreme Court approves flooding Israel with immigrants who have nothing to do with Judaism. Every Israeli citizen needs to ask himself on this sad evening, how is the state of Israel a Jewish state when every foreigner can become a citizen? Okay, so Shas Chairman Aryeh Deri said the decision of the Supreme Court to recognize reform and conservative giur is wrong, very unfortunate, and will cause machlokes, difficult issues, and a severe rift to the nation. Yisrael Beitenu Chairman Avigdor Lieberman, who represents the Russian community, hailed the decision as historic and promised that his party will continue to fight religious coercion and preserve the state of Israel's character as Jewish, Zionist, and a liberal state. So you can see, yes, Stephanie.
I just have a question. Do you know why they rule, why this ruling has this distinction between what's performed inside and outside of the country? So I'm not sure I understand the reason why there was a distinction in the first place, saying we recognize those reform and conservative conversions from abroad, but not inside of Israel. I'm not sure if you have.
I think it has to do with provenance. Ultimately, I think one of the things that young Israeli couples used to do is they used to go to Cyprus and get married by a rabbi. And then because they were married outside of the land of Israel, they could then return to Israel and be a married couple. So, maybe Gary knows.
It was a simple accommodation to diaspora Jews who are predominantly not Orthodox. And even that Orthodox article was wrong. An Orthodox conversion in America is not acceptable for Israel unless it is part of a special program. There is only, I think, one Beit Din in America that is okay. The scandal occurred with Ivanka Trump. Rabbi Lookstein was not a part of that Beit Din. And though he converted her and Israel accepted her conversion because of Trump, he was not, other conversions he did were not accepted by the Israeli rabbinut because they were not part of the, I forget, do you remember what the abbreviation is? Some abbreviation, you have to go the official program of a list of rabbis who they would not publish.
Yeah, there was a blacklist of rabbis who would not qualify. Jessica.
I'm getting a little turned around on expanding the citizenship into the marriage stuff, because they seem to have sort of distinctions in the, leadership of Israel. So just focusing in on the being Jewish gets you Israeli citizenship. Do these folks have such choice words for non-Orthodox converts from abroad? Because as Stephanie said, they're already in. So this sort of feels like plugging a loophole that sort of left out folks who were in Israel.
I sincerely doubt the rabbinut is going to accept my teudah, my document of conversion, especially if I have a female rabbi.
But from a legal standpoint, you're in the clear.
Yeah, but the rabbinut, pretty much keeps it on lockdown. And as Gary pointed out, what are we learning about who can and can't convert or how to convert? Basically, the only thing we're learning so far is depending on who does it. We've learned nothing about how the process of conversion. It's all based upon who does it, where they do it, and who is permissible according to whom. And the Supreme Court is at least trying to say that there should be a pluralistic interpretation about that. Marv.
To get citizenship in Israel, what proof do you need for the right of return?
So you need, I mean, I've been filling out a lot of letters on behalf of.
I mean, can I present myself and say I'm Jewish and get citizenship?
Yeah,
you'll
Jewish. Need documentation. You'll need documentation. You might need your parents. You might need your parents' ketubah. You might need a photograph of the gravestone of your parents. You might need validation or affirmation from a local rabbi who can vouch for the status, for your Jewish status. I'm often filling out
that will fulfill civil authority requirements for citizenship. I'm not talking about whether the rabbinate will recognize me. But for citizenship, the civil authorities will recognize me under a number.
That's right. You just might not be able to get married.
Yeah, law of return is very easy and it's civil. Even if you have a gay marriage in the United States where one partner is not Jewish, the non-Jewish partner is recognized for citizenship and all the benefits that come for new Olim if they come to Israel, even if they are not Jewish, just because they had a documented marriage performed in America or somewhere that permits same-sex marriage.
Now, the question now for the rabbinate to recognize me as Jewish, I would have to present evidence that my mother was Jewish or I was converted by an acceptable Orthodox rabbi in the United States if I'm coming from the United States.
That is correct. In fact, I have, if we just, there are a ton of questions. But I want to roll through this because I think a lot of the questions are going to be cleared up. So this is, we looked at the yeshiva world. Let's take a look at the reform reaction. Because I think as we go through the different reactions, a lot of the issues will remain. And maybe be explained. Okay, so here's what Rabbi Rick Jacobs, who's the president of the Reform Movement, says. The Union for Reform Judaism welcomes the Israeli Supreme Court decision to recognize reform and conservative conversions in the state of Israel. This decision was years in the making and reflects the diversity and vibrancy of Jewish life in Israel and around the world. Today, the court has affirmed the reality that the Jewish people are stronger because of the contributions of the Reform and conservative movements and their commitment to bringing more Jews into the Jewish people. We hope this ruling establishes a precedent that would lead to further recognition of reform and conservative movements in Israel. Since 1995, reform and conservative conversions have been recognized outside of Israel, thanks to today's ruling, the state of Israel will recognize reform and conservative conversions within Israel for the sake of citizenship. This has been a battle in the Israeli courts for over 15 years with over 10 specific petitions. Many individuals were waiting in limbo for years for their status to be confirmed. The Supreme Court held off its ruling to allow for the legislative process to solve the issue and ruled after a lack of process took place. We celebrate the groundbreaking work of our movement and will continue to work for the legitimate rights and recognition of reform and conservative Jews around the world. Okay, so that's the reform movement, stark contrast from the yeshiva world. And what do you think we're going to say here, the conservative movement? Here we go. Here's the conservative movement's response. And hopefully I get a couple of chuckles because all of your questions, I believe, are going to be raised. I'm not sure if they're going to be answered in Rabbi Sachs's response. So he wrote this yesterday. Last evening, Israel's High Court, Bagatz, ruled that conversions performed in Israel through the Masorti and the Reform movements must be recognized by the state for the purpose of citizenship under the law of return. The petition for recognition was first served in 2005, but the case dragged on. So some may be thinking this is a great victory, but what are the real world implications? As most of our rabbis know, under the law of return, any person converted abroad is allowed to make aliyah and obtain citizenship. The law does not differentiate between those converted by Orthodox rabbis and those converted by conservative and Reform rabbis, so long as the conversion was performed in a recognized Jewish community. Of course, this does not obligate the rabbinate to accept our converts as Jews. Okay, so that was that little confusion part that we had in the top of our conversation. Rabbi Sachs outlines it there. The court had previously ruled that conversions performed in Israel by the non-Orthodox denominations for residents of the country, those with a Teudat Zehut, entitled the convert to be registered with the Interior Ministry as Jewish. The question of the right to citizenship remained unresolved. All right, so let me just read that again. It had previously been ruled that conversions performed in Israel by non-Orthodox denominations entitled them to be registered as Jewish, but did not answer the question of whether or not they became citizens. Conversions performed in Israel for those lacking that Teudat Zehut led to neither registrations as Jewish nor to citizenship. Thus, until now, we abstained from converting those without an Israeli ID or needed to see them abroad. This would include students and those here with work visas. So the ruling might not dramatically increase the number of conversions that we will perform. It will, however, make the lives of some of our converts less complicated. And he's going to give us some scenarios here. So let's go through each one at a time. The first scenario, Helga came to Israel from Norway with a student visa to work on a doctorate in Jewish thought. While here, she attended a Masorti shul, spent Shabbatot and holidays with Jewish friends, became fluent in Hebrew, and inquired about joining the Jewish people. Conversion in Israel would leave her open to deportation upon completion of her academic studies, as she did not have a Teudat Zehut. Thus, in cooperation with our Masorti Beit Din in Europe, Helga needed to travel to London to complete her conversion. Upon returning to Israel and a subsequent waiting period of 9 months, she became eligible for citizenship. Now that trip to a Beit Din abroad will no longer be necessary. Okay, does everyone follow that one? Any questions on that scenario? So now you don't have to do this jump to another country, do the conversion, and then jump back, that little dance. Scenario number 2, an intermarried couple from North America decided to make Aliyah. The husband, Jack, was Jewish and the wife, Jill, was not. Both received a Teudat Zehut, Jack as a Jew and Jill as partnered with a Jew. A year after making Aliyah, Jill converted to Judaism through the Masorti movement. Jill then changed her registration in the Interior Ministry to Jewish. A year later, Jack and Jill separated. Until yesterday's ruling, Jill was eligible for deportation. Her right to be in Israel was contingent upon her marital relationship with Jack. The fact that the state recognized her as Jewish did not mean that she was entitled to citizenship. So that was changed with yesterday's court ruling. So Rabbi Sachs writes that the victory in court can be savored, but need not to be celebrated as a triumph over the Orthodox monopoly, although it is that too. It may be seen as moving Israel closer to the more inclusive Zionist reality for which we all strive. Let us not sit on our laurels. The Haredi ministers, the chief rabbis, and many MKs have announced the determination to pass legislation that would undo the rights of our Gerim. The Likud party issued a statement saying this decision endangers the law of return and by extension, Israel's foundation as a Jewish and democratic state. Aryeh Deri called the decision wrong and would cause a serious rift among the Jewish people and vowed to amend the law so that only conversion according to Jewish law will be accepted in the state of Israel. Another MK said of a conversion he did not accept, she is not Jewish, and if someone marries her, the father needs to sit Shiva, rip his clothes, and recite Kaddish. We can be proud of the work done by our colleagues to advance the cause of religious pluralism in Israel, yet we must ever be on guard to ensure that our rights and those of our converts be respected. Okay, so we've seen the three reactions from the Reform movement, the Yeshiva world, and the conservative movement here. So I think we have a little clearer understanding of what is going on here. I just wanted to pause and see if there are any questions or comments. And then I have a little bit of textual sources to go into to give some of the historical and Talmudic background for this dispute. Ben.
So, I mean, this just doesn't seem like that interesting a question for us, unless I'm missing something. I don't think the idea that people who convert to Judaism as conservative or Reform Jews are Jews, I don't think that's going to be controversial with anybody in this group. I think there are controversial issues, though, that face maybe not the state of Israel, but us.
You're okay? You're okay with Reform rabbis' conversions counting as Jews in the state of Israel? That's
anyway.
Okay with you?
Yeah, sure. I think there is, however.
What are they converting to?
They're converting to Judaism. I mean, we're liberal Jews. I think as liberal Jews, we accept that there's more than one way to do it, right? That's kind of foundational to liberal Judaism, right?
But you're taking on an obligation. When you convert to Judaism, halachically, you're taking on the obligation of the halakha. There is no similar obligation in the Reform.
Okay, so I would like to look at this from the other side.
Yeah.
Right? Which is maybe, I think, a more interesting question. Why is it that those who meet the genealogical halachic definition of Judaism get to be Jews?
Great.
Without taking on any obligation whatsoever?
Great. Good question. Why is it that because your mother is Jewish, you can eat all the bacon cheeseburgers you want and you're still in the clear, but only if your mother is Jewish? I think it's a good question. And we're going to go into some of those foundational sources to see how we got to this point. But I wanted to begin with the sort of the popular media response to this week's issue. Jessica and then Jeff.
Yeah, I was just going to say, tactically, it still feels to me like a closing of a gap that had let in plenty of conservative and Reform Jews who had been converted abroad. And now it's just affording that same, right to citizenship for those who convert within Israel. And the reaction feels to me like a sort of slippery slope argument that these ultra-Orthodox rabbis in Israel are given that if they had it their way, I wouldn't have the right of return either. Like they're like, now they're letting the Reform and conservative Jews in Israel, like the one place I thought I had control, that they're like pissed that now that door is opened and they wish they could close the other doors too.
It's a power struggle. It's a power struggle for the state, for the very nature of the state that's happening right here between the MKs and the Rabbanut. But the Rabbanut, they have significant power.
Sure. But just like logically, it's closing a gap that their backlash is to the mere fact that anyone non-Orthodox could be. So it's like, that's sort of the only area they had to rage against.
Right. Look, you're destroying the state. You're ruining that. They will end the law of return. If we're going to have to take the law of return off the books now. So Jews around the world won't be able to come back in. It's like almost a threat there. Jeff and then Stephanie.
I was actually going to say something else, but now I want to ask you something different instead. Do you have a problem with Reform conversion? Do you feel that someone who isn't willing to take on halacha as traditionally understood shouldn't be converting or shouldn't be recognized?
I don't have a problem with them. No.
All right.
Certainly.
Well, because it just seemed that way from the way you asked it before, because you said when someone becomes Jewish, they're agreeing to take on the burden of halacha.
Well, I certainly would not be able to officiate at a wedding of someone who converted in a Reform fashion. So that that would not be appropriate for me, because they wouldn't be Like, for example, if you converted to Judaism as a male, but you didn't get a circumcision, you might be able to do that in the Reform movement. So if you go and convert to Judaism without being circumcised and then come to me with your certificate of having been converted in the Reform movement, well, I might ask some questions about that. And I think my movement is based on sort of if those three definitional questions that sit at the heart, that I will be expelled from the conservative movement if I are to. Everything is negotiable except for three issues. One issue is I can't officiate at a wedding if the people haven't gotten a get previously. Okay, you can't marry people who are still married. That's one issue. The second issue is I can't officiate at an intermarriage. And the third issue is I can't accept patrilineal descent. If I accept any of those three, I will be thrown out of the rabbinical assembly. Those are the three inviolable rules for conservative rabbis. First of all, if someone converts to Judaism and they connect with a Reform rabbi and they connect and they find a Jewish community, I don't have any problem with that. That's a beautiful thing. It's just, it will cause machlokai. It will cause a lot of issues that will need to be resolved in order to maintain some form of halakhic integrity in a way that the conservative movement can understand.
Do you think it would be possible for liberal Judaism, all the denominations, to come together and hammer out some sort of agreement in which everyone would recognize everyone else's process of conversion? Could there be unity within liberal Judaism in the way we strive for within the Democratic Party, but often fail to achieve?
I don't know about the Democratic Party, but could there be unity in Yirtzeh Hashem? I think that's what my movement, this conservative movement, stands on, is Catholic Israel. It's the old Solomon Schechter concept of the whole of Israel is a part of the body of the people of Israel, and that dividing us up into various who does this and who does that according to what's permissible and what's impermissible only fragments us, and is mostly based off of a 19th century post-Enlightenment breakdown of faith and belief, where people were either intent on holding on to their fundamentalist faith through rigid observance, or people sort of acknowledged enlightenment and the inability to hold on to that rigidity after it. Judah and then Ellen.
I find it ironic that the Orthodox Jews, on deciding who's a Jew, are paying attention to the Supreme Court, which has an Arab Christian deciding this.
Which has what?
There's an Arab Christian on the Israeli Supreme Court.
Yeah, well, I think that, yeah, and I
rabbis listening to him as far to who should be a Jew. I mean, that's just kind of ironic, I think.
And I think that would bother them a great deal, that the Supreme Court would deign to enter into areas of halakha in which it's not permitted. Stephanie.
Yeah, I mean, to me, it just seems like a really, like this whole deal, like a really strong reaction to something that's 30 or 40 conversions a year to compare it to probably hundreds, or I don't know how many. I just looked it up. I couldn't find actual numbers of people making aliyah probably from abroad. So, I mean, I have previously read already that the more right-winged parties in general didn't want to rely on law return like it is today, while others obviously said, well, if you were Jewish enough to get killed, you're certainly Jewish enough to live in Israel. But I think this is where the whole discussion is really going, is they don't want any more goyims, basically, as they're saying, who only have like a Jewish grandparent, for example, to move there. So I think this is just like kind of blown up thing for, this is not really what it's about, is I think what I want to say. It's not about those 30 conversions. It's about the general idea moving into direction to only let people who are, according to their standards, Jewish, not a Jewish father, not a Jewish grandparent, but only
You
people.
got it. You got it. We get to define the terms, who is in and who is out. And we're not going to let this body with an Arab Christian on it. We're not going to let this secular body. We're not going to let these people living on the other side of the world. We have that body. And by the way, Stephanie, we're right? They certainly believe that they're right. So that, that plays a factor in it too. Ellen.
So this seems like a very complicated question to me. All of my family roots for generations are Jewish. My family came to this country in the mid 1850s, and my great-grandparents started practicing Reform Judaism. And so that's the way that I was brought up. But obviously, I can't document any of that stuff, but I feel very hard put not to feel that if I move to Israel, I should be recognized as a Jew and eligible for Israeli citizenship.
Yeah, I'm looking for some of the documentation here that I have filled out for making Aliyah to see what they are actually asking for in their letters. But yeah, you're going to need to have a rabbi state that you're Jewish. Like, for example, here I can show you. This is.
I'm counting on you, Rabbi.
Well, here we go. Well, I've been writing these because I'm finding that people are beginning to move in the midst and thinking about making Aliyah. So, for example, here's one letter: synagogue sample proof of Judaism. Synagogue letterhead, to whom it may concern. I know that X, son, daughter of, is born to a Jewish mother. That's what I need to validate to the state of Israel. And I've been filling out those letters. Gary.
I'm kind of fascinated we've taken this discussion on, and especially from this viewpoint, since we've been pretty adamant that we're not going to talk politics. And the way this is framed is it's a political decision and not a religious one. So one of the things that interests me in this topic mostly is according to halakha, and it's deraita and not derabanan about the way we're supposed to treat the ger. So how do the converts? So how do the Orthodox come to terms with this? And even more so, it's a halakhic deraita obligation that when there's doubt about a biblical obligation, we're supposed to do it anyway because we might have the facts wrong, which I believe is also deraita and not derabanan. So how do these rabbis all of a sudden throw back on deraita halakha to make their derabanan decisions on gerut?
I don't know. I don't think I can explain. I mean, I think it's. I mean, I don't know if this is. I'm trying to do a political conversation here, but.
Isn't that the heart of our conversation on conversion? I mean.
Well, it was like the only analogy that I have that is relevant. It's like when the Bush v. Gore Supreme Court decision came down and Justice Scalia argued on behalf of the 14th Amendment for federalist powers over state rights. That's an esoteric reference, for most people. I just think people, when it comes down to power, people will subvert their intentions. It's also a question of emphasis. Could you choose to emphasize embracing the stranger? Of course you could. What would be the harm for the Orthodox world to choose to embrace the stranger and really highlight that? They don't choose to do that. Maybe that undercuts their power position. Maybe it's not deemed to be efficacious to be open. Maybe there's a fear that once you open up a little bit of a crack, the whole wall will come tumbling down.
So that's the interest, for me, that's the interesting way to approach this. To Jeff's point, I just want to say, if anyone's not heard of or not read the book, Jew versus Jew, which was very popular like 25 years ago, Denver supposedly had a multi-denominational bait-in that failed miserably. And it just goes through the history of Jews in America trying to be multi-denominational and the failures it had. It has to do, there's great parts on the adoption, the Imahot as part of the Amida, and the fights that did in congregations. And it's a really worthwhile book to probably revisit again. I haven't read it in like 25 years.
Gary, as I recall, that the conflict, I may be wrong, but if I'm remembering correctly, the conflicts in that book had more to do with Orthodoxy versus liberal Judaism than with conflicts among the liberal denominations.
Yeah, everyone everyone agreed on ground rules for everything, and when it came down to make a decision, they all threw them out.
Yeah, I think that's about right. So here we look here. I want to look here. This is Shai Cohen at Harvard, or formerly at Berkeley. He writes, of all the doctrines asserted by rabbinic Judaism, few are as surprising or indeed as controversial as matrilineal descent. This is where I wanted to get to, just in line of deciding who was born to whom. The notion that the offspring of a Gentile mother and a Jewish father is a Gentile, while the offspring of a Jewish mother and a Gentile father is a Jew. This precept, accepted universally among the classic commentators, seems inconsistent with the rest of Jewish law, in which it is almost always the father's ancestry that is determinative. It is the father and only the father who determines the child's status as a priest or a Levite, a member of the tribe of Judah or Benjamin, a descendant of the Hashmonean house or the Davidic. Genealogy indeed is determined by the father regarding all categories except the most important, whether a child is a Jew in the first place. Indeed, the principle of matrilineal descent appears so incongruous that the leading German rabbi of the first half of the 20th century, Yechiel Jacob Weinberg, was moved to comment, why is a child as his mother? The answer is not quite clear. The answer is not quite clear. So let's take a look at the Mishnah. So I wanted to go back to these sources where this is all coming from to understand the nature of the conflict. So this comes from the Mishnah, the second century document of laws. This is from the Mishnah of Kiddushin 3:12. Wherever there is a valid betrothal and no sin, a child follows the male with regard to the familial status. This was, as just noted by Shai Cohen, but I want to scroll down here to the bottom, to the relevant section here. Any woman for whom there is no betrothal, either to him or to others, the child is like her. Which is this? This is a child of a non-Jewish maidservant or a non-Jewish woman. Now I have some more commentary on this here. This is from Rabbi Joshua Kolb. Sorry, I think I hit the wrong button here. This is from Rabbi Joshua Kolb. And there's a better translation here. This is from Daniel Isaacson, who's the JFCS, his source sheet here. Any woman who cannot contract Kiddushin, Kiddushin is the betrothal, the marriage, with that particular person, with others, the child follows her status. And what case is this? Is the child of a female slave or a Gentile woman. So according to Rabbi Kolb, this last section is where we begin to see the matrilineal principle. We should note that it is incomplete. The Mishnah states that the child of a non-Jewish woman or slave is not Jewish or is a slave, but it does not specifically address the status of the child of a Jewish mother and a male father. The Mishnah begins discussing a subject which will be covered throughout the remainder of Kiddushin. This is the lineage part. So we have already encountered stories of different genealogical statuses. We've talked about the priesthood, the Levites, the Israelites. The Mishnah here discusses how these lineages are transmitted from generation to generation, namely the issue of whom the child's lineage follows, that of the father or the mother. We should note that the lineage was probably the most important factor in choosing a spouse in the ancient Jewish world and was probably a key factor in the entire ancient world. Indeed, until the modern period, many matches were made based on lineage. The final clause of our Mishnah contains the principle of matrilineal descent of the child follows the mother and not the father. This principle is surprising since ancient Jewish society was clearly patriarchal. Men were almost always the heads of the households. The women typically leave her family to enter the man's house. Furthermore, it seems quite clear the Bible operates on the principle of patrilineal descent. Throughout the Tanakh, men marry women of foreign descent, and the women assimilate into their husbands' culture and homes. The same is true of the Second Temple literature. How the matrilineal principle came to dominate rabbinic halacha and literature is a mystery, according to Rabbi Kolb. There are a few places in rabbinic literature with a hint of a patrilineal principle, but few of them, and they are usually rejected. All right, so this is the general rule here from the Mishnah Torah. This is the Rambam. The status of an offspring from a Gentile man or from a Gentile woman is the same as his mother's. We disregard the father. All right, so this is the origin of it. And as you can see, not clear exactly why it followed along these principles. In fact, it says here the pre-exilic, this is still Rabbi Kolb, I believe. This is Shai Cohen, excuse me. The pre-exilic portions of the Hebrew Bible are not familiar with the matrilineal principle. Numerous Israelite heroes and kings married foreign women. Judah married a Canaanite, Joseph an Egyptian, Moses a Midianite and an Ethiopian, David a Philistine, and Solomon women of every description. Although Exodus 34 and Deuteronomy 7 prohibit intermarriage only with the Canaanites, a prohibition that was supposed to have originated with the patriarchs Abraham and Isaac, some Israelites extended the prohibition to include all foreigners. But it never occurred to anyone in pre-exilic times to argue that such marriages were null and void. Marriage was non-sacramental, private acquisition of the woman by a man, and the state had little or no in the matter. The foreign woman who was married an Israelite husband was supposed to leave her gods in her father's house. But even if she did not, it never occurred to anyone to argue that her children were not Israelites. So that even if you take your little rosary with you after you convert to Judaism, no one would have ever argued that your children were not Israelites, is what this text is saying. Marv.
If we go back to Abraham, we certainly recognize that Sarah and Abraham were a couple, and Sarah gave birth, of course, to Isaac, whereas Hagar had Ishmael. So there we defined being the Jewish offspring came from Sarah. But if you go to Rebecca, who had twins, she had Esau and Jacob. So there, the Edomites should be Jewish. Because we certainly recognize Rebecca as married to Isaac. So, I mean, it's very...
Yeah, so I mean, I think that's the point. There's no pre-exilic notion of matrilineal descent here. We don't really find that in a way that works. So this is really after the destruction of the Second Temple in the Mishnah and in the Talmud. The reason that was often given is perhaps it was challenging to always know who the father was during difficult times, and therefore the presumption that the child was Jewish, if it came out of a Jewish woman, was something that worked, was probably very pragmatic. Stephanie, and then Ben.
I just had a thought. So, what is it like with, let's say, an egg donor, or what is a?
Good question. So it's the same rule. It's who did the child come out of? So if you have a egg donated from a Jewish woman, and you have a sperm donated from a Jewish male, and you have a carrier, a female, who is not Jewish, the child is not Jewish because the child exited the womb through a non-Jewish woman. That is the halacha. Ben.
Yeah, I would love for somebody to defend this practice on its merits.
It's good. Finally, it only took us 50 minutes for you guys to lighten up a little bit. Good. Keep going.
I mean, I won't defend it, but I'd like to hear somebody defend it.
I think Marv wants to. Marv, you want to defend it? No, he doesn't. Gary Sokol wants to try.
Well, I want to ask you a question because in reading that, it was very interesting. And you said you don't like to get into the technicals, but Jewish marriage ceremony has two parts. There's Kiddushin and Nisuin. And they were very explicit there about the need for Kiddushin to get the question of Jewishness. And that Nisuin marriage, which we would consider marriage, does not get you defined as Jewish. Wasn't that what it was saying? That, I mean, I only read the translation.
You're probably right. You're
probably saying the betrothal had to be valid. The betrothal had to be valid. It mentioned nothing about marriage. It mentioned all about Kiddushin.
The taking of the woman. So yeah, so Gary's right from a really technical point of view. Back when this was being written, the Jewish wedding ceremony were two different ceremonies. There was the nuptials and then the betrothal. Today, we just combine those two ceremonies.
And they could be as much as a year apart, right? In all times, yeah.
Into one. But I just read it as a Jewish woman can't get married and therefore is just disqualified from being able to participate in that ceremony. Do you want to defend this matrilineal descent? Does anyone here want to try to defend this? See, for me, I really love Beth Sholom because it's egalitarian, and that is one of our core values. And we have always led I don't want to be hyperbolic, but we've always taken a lot of pride in our pluralism and our egalitarianism and our inclusion of women in full. So I then have a challenging time answering the question, why does it matter if your parent is a male or a female? If our key value here is egalitarianism and equality across the sexes, then that seems like a non-egalitarian question to ask when it comes to inclusion. Now that would place me sort of outside the bounds of the conservative movement and in quite a pickle in terms of who is and who isn't a Jew. I like to say that when I was taking codes with Rabbi Joel Roth, 18 years ago, he told me by the year 2020, any wedding that you officiate at, if one of the partners comes from a Reformed family, the presumption has to be that that partner is not Jewish. And that's what he said about 18 years ago, because of the flow of generations and documentation and decision-making since 1985, that the presumption would be that there'd be too many marriages and too many mixtures. And at some point it's going to be through the patrilineal side versus the matrilineal side. So the presumption is just going to have to be that they're not Jewish. And that's where the conservative movement was 18 years ago. And we're kind of still there at the moment, but this is a little bit of a third rail, which is why I like it. Jessica, and then Stephanie.
I don't know if this counts as defending, but from a logical standpoint, one of the rationales I had always understood to reinforce the matrilineal line is, who the mom is, sometimes there's a question mark about who the dad is.
That's right. But what if I told you now DNA testing can clear that up? So why are we still holding on to this old methodology? Basically, if we're going to say that 1800 years ago, we needed to observe the birth to be sure to whom it was birthed, and therefore that was the only basis we could use to determine status, well, we seem to have other observable bases that we can use now.
Yeah, I guess it's tough for me to think through it because the application that I've seen is so often exclusionary as opposed to inclusion.
Tell me, explain.
That the first 45 minutes of this conversation, it was around like how the rabbinate doesn't want to count all these people as Jewish. So it starts to feel like we're just looking for reasons to disqualify people.
Yep.
Which is not the direction I would like to see.
Yeah.
Reason to go.
Yeah. I thank you for that, Jessica. And I agree. And I think there is that. I don't think it's exclusive to the Orthodoxy. I think we're guilty of it too. I'm guilty of it. I want to place myself, this suspicious nature, the critical eye is the first eye. And I have more texts on what you should do. I see there's a question from Sandra and a question from Stephanie. Is it on this point, Sandra? Okay, Stephanie, well, I can't hear you, Sandra.
Yeah, mine was kind of.
Okay, go Stephanie, yeah.
Hey, unmute. You asked the question about defense
Yes.
of and these rulings were made a long time ago, before there was DNA testing. And in the past, the mother was closer to the child, any child, a male or a female with the breastfeeding, before it was customary to send the child out. And so I think because of the closeness in the relationship in early life, that may be defending matrilineal descent. A Jewish mother would transmit Jewish values.
Yeah, probably not only Jewish, but you might be able to say that about any sort of traditional setup several hundred years ago, that often the heritage is often dictated, the home is dictated by the woman. Stephanie.
Yeah, my comment was a bit more for what Jessica said, and also I guess it includes a question. So we know that the Jewish law was changed basically from it was patrilineal descent, and then it became matrilineal because you couldn't, right? Isn't that what we talked about more? Like
Eventually, that's right. Everything in pre-exilic days and the time of the temple and the times of the Bible is determined by the patriarchy, and then we have this interesting shift that takes place after the destruction of the temple to matrilineal descent. That's right.
And that was exactly what Jessica said, what I wanted to say. We have scientific methods that are, at least when it comes to paternity, 99.999%, like, we know it's real, so you can definitely tell who's a parent to somebody. So I was wondering if you or anybody else felt like this in a couple decades or 100 years, you think this law could be changed, like when it goes with like the scientific advances that we.
Yeah, so you raised two questions, and I'll answer that because we're having this conversation because we're in our 100th year and we've operated one way in the past 100 years, and now we're going to be in a post-COVID world, and we're going to have to try to bring people back together and gather them. And so what are the principles that we're going to base it on? And egalitarianism and equality across the sexes is certainly key. So how do we validate that? I think is a good hard question. The problem is when I have raised the issue to some of my colleagues, it's like I've touched the third rail in a lot of ways. It's like a total fracture of the halachic system and of, who is and who isn't a Jew. I'm going to make it impossible for people to get married. I'm going to subvert 2,000 years of unbroken tradition. There's a legal fiction that is definitely very strong that people like to uphold, this idea that we have paperwork. We have paperwork. We don't have any paperwork, but this fiction of paperwork is very strong in the movements. And I'm not personally a big fan of legal fictions, and I'm a fan of equality and egalitarianism. And I'm a fan of Klal Yisrael. I would like to see us stop dividing up the Jewish people based upon who their mother is or who their mother isn't, or what they eat or what they don't eat, or where they daven or where they don't daven. That might have worked in the 20th century. I don't think it works any longer. I don't think the next generations of Judaism are going to be deciding who to congregate based upon if they turn their lights on Shabbat or if they carry. I think they're going to be deciding it based on other factors altogether. And I think the old denominations serve to be totally divisive. And your reactions to the language and what Jessica described, that feeling of being suspect, is just so gross. I really think that mentality, this of trying to maintain things, has really led to pushing a lot of people away from Judaism. Gary Sokol, you've been dying to get in here.
To what Jessica said, it's interesting, and it shows our bias right away that we say Reform believes in patrilineal descent. Well, that's not true. You have to have a father who's Jewish, and you have to accept Judaism. There are actually examples where Orthodox can recognize, and this was an amazing when I looked at this, that you could have a grandfather who is recognized as Jewish by Orthodoxy, but is not recognized as Jewish by Reform, because you not only have to have a father or mother who's Jewish, but you have to accept your Jewish education. And you have to
have been raised in a Jewish environment. That's another, right.
You have to embrace, which I think conservatives would say, you know, we could do a simple gior for someone who was raised in that. As you said, you do a ritual, you bloodletting, and you do certain things and you're done, right?
But except for one thing, which is when they become a bar or a bat mitzvah, they have an out. And so each of these children who has been converted as a youth comes to their bar mitzvah, they get the choice to say, you know what, I don't want to be Jewish, or they get to stand in front of the community on their bar mitzvah and become a bar mitzvah. And I will say to children, this is your out.
What?
I do.
I didn't have that out, did I?
Wait a minute. You were converted to Judaism as a child?
No, I wasn't.
No, only children who are taken to mikveh and converted of a non-Jewish mother as children get an. So let's say your father is Jewish and your mother's not Jewish,
right?
And your mother doesn't want to convert to Judaism, so you get me to take them to mikveh and to convert the child as a baby. Happens all the time,
right?
When the child becomes bar mitzvah, I tell that child, you get an out now. You can leave. Because once the child reaches the age of bar mitzvah, they have to reaffirm the conversion, which was done while they were a minor.
So in the great words of Walter Sobchak, you return your library card, you're not a Jew anymore?
I have yet to come across a kid. It actually works wonderfully to motivate the child. It gives the child a sense of empowerment to get up and say, you know what, I like being a Jew, I am a Jew, and I'm going to claim my Jewishness. I've yet to have a child say later. Hasn't happened yet. Hasn't happened. I got a lot more questions. Ellen.
I just think it's so interesting that we as Jews are working so hard to define who's Jewish, but those who are against us have no problem in looping us all into the same group.
Yeah, I mean, we certainly do plenty of good work dividing and taking our own legs out from under ourselves. There's no question about that. Sandra?
Well, you were saying you think that these rules turn people away from Judaism. I disagree. I think that's why we have Orthodox, Reform, Conservative, Reconstructionist. Because if you don't agree, if you don't like matrilineal descent, okay, so and you're a patrilineal Jew, so you're Reform. So what's wrong with that? They're still Jewish.
I'm agreeing with you. I would like them all to be under the same roof. I'm agreeing with you. I just want us all under the same roof. Why do we have to divide? Why do we have to have one kind of community against another community?
It's important to divide because of this, because you don't agree with certain rulings. Maybe the child wasn't circumcised, the male child wasn't circumcised. There's a movement now.
That's right. That's right. So there's the defense, Ben. There's your defense that you were looking for earlier, comes from Sandra, which is the traditional approach, which is, Sandra, this is, I mean, go make the defense of what we've always done.
Mm-hmm.
No, go do it. Do it right now.
It's just like the argument, if somebody's on a desert island and there are two shuls. And so they say, well, what are these? Why do you have two shuls? Well, that's the one I don't go to.
Good. I like it. So maybe that's why we need the Mashiach. Maybe we'll always have two shuls until the Mashiach comes. And that just might be a part of, who we are as a people. I'm a little more progressive than a lot of my colleagues in some ways. And in this way, I think the divisions that we have between Reform Jews and conservative Jews and conservadox Jews, a whole lot of people defining themselves as conservadox these days, I think end up fracturing ourselves as a community and holding us into old definitions that are much harder for the institutions to hold than they are for anyone else to hold, because no one, I mean, it's just, I have to spend most of my time explaining these definitions. That's why some of my students were here on this class, because they, you know, I have to spend a lot of time explaining some of these esoteric rules that Gary sort of began with and framed with, because it's really hard for us to understand. Jessica.
I was just going to bring it back to sort of where we started in terms of thinking through these questions. I'm always drawn to the impact. So as we saw from the conservative response to the Supreme Court decision, it means that this Norwegian woman doesn't have to spend 9 months in London. You know, so like when we talk about changing criteria or divisions or whatever, like I always sort of think through the impact. And so if we're going from matrilineal to patrilineal, you know, like what is that impact and how does it further divide? Maybe it brings people in, but I couldn't help but think of when we walked through the conservative document of like how to deal with women several weeks ago, and like my whole reaction was like, was this a report card, and if you failed, like now you're out of the conservative movement? That's sort of, how does this impact the communities and the actual humans who are like trying to assert their spirituality in different places?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's probably good for the state of Israel if you want a political opinion. I think that the more fundamentalist the state of Israel becomes, the farther away it gets from its initial Zionist vision, and the more it just becomes a fundamentalist state, which is not as I would understand what the Zionist mission would be. So I think to the extent that we're moving towards a more pluralistic Klal Yisrael understanding of who the Jewish people are. But yeah, this issue of who and who is not a Jew, who is accepted as a Jew, I'll close with this. I tell all of my conversion students, my documentation isn't worth anything. I tell them that first meeting. I said, if you want this conversion to be approved, in order to get approval by some other body or some other group or whatever, I said, you're probably at the wrong person here. I said, when you convert to Judaism, you have to find a teacher and a community that resonates with who you are and a way to self-identify as a Jew, so that when you go to the mikveh, when you join the Jewish people, you have joined it in a definition that is who you are and connects to you, as opposed to taking it on from somebody else. And so if people are looking for approval from the chief rabbinate, I send them elsewhere. But if they're looking to have a Jewish life according to the values that our congregation puts out and to be part of our congregation or another congregation with similar pluralistic, egalitarian, open values, then who cares what someone to the right or to the left of you might think, because you have the opportunity here to convert in a community with us. So that's the framing that I give to it, because I can't ever account for what the chief rabbinate is going to do or what the Supreme Court of the state of Israel is going to do, and I can't really pretend otherwise. So that's my final word. Any last questions? All right, well, really, really good conversation today. I think we've only scratched the issue. What I didn't get to was this. Let me just show you. What I didn't get to you were the 3 ways in which someone enters the covenant: by circumcision, by immersion, and by temple offering. So it lists here this is the Mishnah Torah, this is the Rambam, the ways in which we convert to Judaism. And I just wanted to note that there's no difference between the way that I convert my students and the way the Orthodox rabbi. They're all according to the Mishneh Torah's rubrics. There's same questions that get asked. And so a lot of this just has to do with who gets to be in charge and who gets to dictate the power of who is allowed in and who is allowed out. And I don't know if we'll ever solve that definitively, but maybe when the Mashiach comes, as Sandra says, those 2 synagogues will merge, right, Ben? We can merge the synagogues at the time of the Messiah. So I like your questions. I want to continue this question because I think, thank you, Ellen. It's a very interesting topic. And maybe Ben and whomever else here wants to think about how we as a community want to engage in this topic so that we are able to interact with the rest of the movement and the rest of the Jewish world in a way that has integrity for who we are as a community. And with that, I will say so long.